Chapter 18.
Augustus rode back to camp a little after sunset, thinking the work would have stopped by then. The cattle were being held in a long valley near the river, some 5 miles from town. Every night, Call went across the river with 5 or 6 hands and came back with 200 or 300 Mexican cattle. Longhorns mostly, skinny as rail and wild as deer. Whatever they got, they branded the next day with the part of the crew that had rested during the hard end of the work. Only Call worked both shifts. If he slept, it was an hour or 2 before breakfast or after supper. The rest of the time he worked, and so far as anyone could tell, the pace agreed with him. He had taken to riding the hell bitch 2 days out of 3, and the mare seemed no more affected by the work than he was. Bolivar had not taken kindly to being moved to a straggly camp out in the brush, with no dinner bell to whack or crowbar to whack it with. He kept his 10-gauge near the chuck box and scowled at everybody. The Irishmen were so intimidated that they were always the last ones in line. As a consequence, they got little to eat and were no longer as fat as they had been the day they arrived. It seemed the Irishmen were a part of the outfit, though. Their total inexperience was offset by an energy and a will to learn that impressed even Call. He let him stay in the first place because he was so short-handed he couldn't afford to turn away any willing hand. By the time more competent men arrived, the Irishmen had gotten over their fear of horses and worked with a will. Not being cowboys, they had no prejudice against working on the ground. Once shown the proper way to throw a roped animal, they cheerfully flung themselves on whatever the ropers drug up to the branding fire, even if it was a 2-year-old bull with lots of horn and a mean disposition. They had no great finesse, but they were dogged and would eventually get the creature down. This willingness to work on the ground was indispensable, for most cowboys would rather eat poison than be forced to dismount. They all fancied themselves ropers and swelled like toads if asked to do work they considered beneath their dignity. Since there were few goats to steal near camp, Bowles' menus relied heavily on beef, with the usual admixture of beans. He had brought along a sack of chilies, and he dumped them liberally into his beans, feeling free to augment the dish with pieces of whatever varmint strayed into his path, rattlesnakes mostly, with an occasional armadillo. For several days, the crew ate the fiery beans without complaint, only the Irishman showing pronounced ill effects. Young Sean had difficulty with the peppers. He could not eat the beans without weeping, but with all the work, his appetite raged to such a point that he could not avoid the beans. He ate them and wept. Most of the crew liked the boy and had decided to treat his frequent weepings as a simple, mild aberration, related in some way to his nationality. Then one day, Jasper Fant caught Bolivar skinning a rattlesnake. He assumed Bolivar was merely going to make himself a rattlesnake belt, but he happened to turn around as Bowles sliced the snake right into the stew pot, a sight which agitated him greatly. He had heard that people ate snake, but had never expected to do so himself. When he told the other hands what he had seen, they were so aroused they wanted to hang Bolivar on the spot, or at least rope him and drag him through the prickly pear to improve his manners. But when they approached Augustus with the information about the snake, he laughed at them. "You boys must have been raised on satin pillows," he said. "If you'd rangered, you'd have got a taste for snake long ago." He then proceeded to give them a lecture on the culinary properties of rattlesnake, a lecture that Jasper, for one, received rather stiffly. It might be superior to chicken, rabbit, and possum, as Gus claimed, but that didn't mean he wanted to eat it. His visits to the stew pot became a source of irritation to everyone. He would fish around in the pot for several minutes, seeking portions of meat that he could feel confident that hadn't come from the snake. Such delicacy exasperated the rest of the crew, who were usually so hungry by supper time that they could ill abide waits. Call and Jake rode in while Augustus was eating. The sight of Gus with his plate full put Jake in a low temper, since he himself had handled branding irons all day while Gus had amused himself in town and stayed fresh. They had branded over 400 cattle since sunup, enough to make Jake wish that he had never brought up the notion of taking cattle to Montana. "Hello, girls," Augustus said. "You look like you've done a heavy laundry. Wait till I finish my beef and I'll help you off your horses." "I don't want all of mine," Jake said. "Hand me a plate and I'll eat on my way to town." Call felt irritated. It was the first full day Jake had put in since the work started, and mostly he had lazed through it. "Why must you go?" he asked, trying to keep it mild. "We're gonna make our last drag tonight. We have to get started, you know." Jake dismounted and walked over to the grub, pretending he hadn't heard. He didn't want an argument with Call if he could avoid one. In truth, he had not been thinking very far ahead since drifting back to Lonesome Dove. He had often thought of the fortune that could be made in cattle in Montana, but then a man could think of a fortune without actually having to go and make one. The only good thing to be said for trailing cattle that far north was that it beat hanging in Arkansas or rotting in some jail. Then there was Lori. So far, she hadn't had a single fit, but that didn't mean she wouldn't if she found out he was leaving. On the other hand, he couldn't very well take her. No one in his memory had ever tried to bring a woman into one of Call's camps. It was all vexing, having decisions to make, and yet having no time to think them through. He got himself a hunk of beef, some of the old Mexican's peppery stew, and went back to where Call and Gus were sitting. He felt distinctly irritated with Call. The man never seemed to need any of the things other humans needed, like sleep or women. Life for Call was work, and he seemed to think everyone else ought to see it the same way. "Why, Jake, you look plumb grumpy," Augustus said when Jake sat down and began to eat. "Honest work don't agree with you, I guess." "No, I'm about as cooked as this beef," Jake said. Newt and the two Irishmen were holding the herd. The Irishmen were particularly good night herders because they could sing. Their melodies seemed to soothe the cattle. In fact, the whole camp enjoyed the Irish singing. Newt couldn't sing a lick, but he had rapidly developed into such a skilled cowhand that Call felt a little guilty for having held him back for so long. "I'm sure partial to the evening," Augustus said. "Evening and the morning. If we just didn't have to have the rest of the darn day, I'd be a lot happier." "If we have a good drag tonight, we can start north on Monday," Call said. "How's that suit you, Jake?" "Oh, fine," Jake said. "But you boys don't have to try and suit me with your drive. I've been thinking of spending some time in San Antonio." "That's a big disappointment," Augustus said. "It's a long way to Montana, and I was counting on you to keep up the conversation." "Well, count again," Jake said, deciding on the spot that he wouldn't go. Call knew there was no point in reminding Jake that the whole drive had been his idea. The man was willful as a child in some respects. Show him what he ought to do, and he would dig in his heels and refuse. It was particularly irritating in this instance, because nobody in the outfit had ever been further north in Kansas. Jake knew the country and could be a big help. "Jake, we wish you'd come," he said. "We were relying on you to help us choose the route." "No, Jake don't like to help his compañeros," Augustus said. "He's got his own fancies to cultivate. The fact that he caused all this don't mean a thing to him." "Did I cause it?" Jake asked, trying to keep the talk light. "Of course you caused it," Augustus said. "Who was it said Montana's a cowman's paradise?" "Well, it is," Jake said. "Then you should have picked a cattleman to mention it to. Not two old laws like us." "Hell, you're cattleman now," Jake said. "All it takes is cows." "Are you aiming to marry Lori?" Augustus asked, changing his tack. "Marry her?" Jake asked, astonished. "Why would I marry her?" "Well, you could do worse," Augustus said. "An old scamp like you's apt to break down any time. It would be nice to have a young woman to rub your back and bring you soup." "I ain't near as old as you," Jake reminded him. "Why don't you marry her?" It was talk he didn't care to hear. Swift Bill Spettle had let a horse kick him that morning, had a knot on his forehead as big as a goose egg. You best let Bowl rub some ointment on that bump, Call suggested. The Spettle boys were mighty green, but they were not afraid to work. Call got up and went to get his supper. As soon as he left, Augustus stretched his legs and grinned at Jake. I played a hand with Laurie this afternoon, he said. I believe you've made her restless, Jake. How's that? She does seem to be looking forward to San Francisco, Augustus said. Jake felt himself getting more and more peevish. Lorena should have known better than to play cards with Gus, or even talk to him, though she could hardly be blamed for listening. It was well known that Gus would talk to a stump if he couldn't find a human. I doubt she'll want to spend no time in San Antonio, Augustus said. That's where she was before she came here, and women don't like to go backwards. Most women will never back up an inch in their whole lives. I can't see that it's any of your affair what we do, Jake said. I guess she'd go to San Antonio if I say to. If she don't, she'll just get left. Bring her on the drive, Augustus said. She might like Montana, and if she gets tired of looking at the ass end of these cows, you could always stop in Denver. It was something, the talent Gus had for saying the very thing that a man might have been half thinking. Jake had more than once considered Denver, regretted more than once he hadn't stopped there instead of going to Fort Smith. Going along with a drive would be a good enough way to get back to Denver. Of course, that didn't settle the question of Laurie, exactly.
Good stuff. That's top notch.
You know as well as I do, Call would never allow no woman in his camp, he said. It was surprising that Gus would even suggest such a thing.
This is good.
Call ain't God. He don't have to get his way every day of the month. If she was my sweetheart, I'd bring her. And if he didn't like it, he could just bite himself. You couldn't afford her, Gus. No better card player than you are, Jake said, standing up. I believe I'll go to town. I don't feel like bumping around Mexico tonight. Without another word, he got on his horse and left. Call watched him go and walked back over to Gus. You think he'll come with us on the drive? He asked. Not unless you let him bring his girl, Augustus said. Why, is Jake that crazy? Call asked. Does he want to bring that girl? It never occurred to him, but it has now, Augustus said. I invited her. Call was impatient to get off, but Gus's remark stopped him. Gus was never one to do the usual, but this was stretching things, even for him. You done what? Told him he ought to bring Laurie along, Augustus said. She'd improve the company. I won't have it, Call said at once. God damn you, you know better than that. Ain't you late for work? Augustus asked. I can't enjoy the night for all this jabbering. Call decided it was some joke. Even Gus wouldn't go that far. I'm going, he said. You watch this end. Augustus lay back, his head against his saddle. It was a clear night, the stars just beginning to appear. Needle, Bert, P, Dietz, Dish were waiting to go to Mexico. The rest of the boys were holding the herd. Bowl was peeing on the campfire, causing it to sputter. Call turned his horse and rode toward the river.
Chapter